My name is Maud Rao, and I am a docent at the San Diego Air and Space Museum, and I'd like to welcome you to my presentation called Almost Famous: The Fates, Follies, and Misfortunes of Forgotten Flyers. You know, all throughout history, we are always celebrating the first person to make a significant achievement, like the first person to climb Mount Everest or the first person to run the 4-minute mile. But we forget that there are other people that were involved in that competition and had an important impact on the person who eventually achieved the feat. And the same is true in aviation. And the talk I'm going to give today is about some of the other people that we've forgotten in history, but played an important role in the history of aviation. And I'm going to cover three aspects of this particular question. First, I'm going to talk about the first balloon flight, the race of the aeronauts. And we remember the Montgolfier brothers, who were the first people to design and build a balloon that would lift men into the air, but we forget the other people that were involved. Then I'm going to talk about the first trans-channel flight, the flight between England and France. And then I'll end with probably one of the more important achievements, which is the mad dash across the Atlantic, in which Charles Lindbergh became the first person to do a transatlantic flight from New York to Paris. So let's talk about the first balloon flight. As I mentioned earlier, we typically associate balloons with the Montgolfier brothers, who are pictured on the left. But there was another person named Jacque Charles who was developing ballooning around the same time, but he used a different approach. The Montgolfier brothers, Joseph and Jacques Etienne Montgolfier, were children of Pierre and Anne Durand Montgolfier. They lived in a town south of Lyon, France, called Annonay, and they were 2 of 16 children of Pierre and Anne. Anne was quite prolific, and when their father, who owned a paper-making business, passed away, the management of the business went to the oldest male. His name was Raymond. Unfortunately, Raymond also passed away, and ownership of the business and management of the business fell to Jacques. Now, Jacques and Joseph were 2 different types of people. Jacques had a mind for business, he was very analytical, and Joseph was considered more of a dreamer. One day, Joseph was observing a fire, and he noticed that the smoke was rising and the embers were rising. And it occurred to him that perhaps there's a different type of gas above the fire which is causing the smoke and the embers to rise. So he devised a little experiment with his brother. They built a small frame out of wood and covered it with paper on 5 sides. The frame was 3 foot by 3 foot by 4 foot, and it was made of very thin pieces of wood. They lit a fire with some paper and put it underneath this frame. And to their astonishment, they observed that this frame rose to the ceiling, and their housekeeper was actually quite astonished as well. Well, they had realized that they may have discovered something new. And so they set out to investigate this and did some experiments to demonstrate whether they could use this quote unquote new gas to lift things off the earth. Their first experiment, the one that I just described, was done in November of 1782. They went on to build a larger frame, and in December of 1782, they started a fire, put the frame above the fire, and the lifting force was so great that they couldn't hold it to the ground, and they had to release it. And they observed it travel 1.2 miles downwind, and to the astonishment of everyone that was gathered. And it was their first unmanned outdoor test of their concept of hot air ballooning. Now, locally, the Montgolfiers became quite famous after people were talking about this particular experiment. And in June of 1783, they did another test in Annonay, France, where they had a much larger balloon, a balloon of almost of 28,000 cubic feet. And it was their first public demonstration of their ballooning concept. When they released the balloon, it traveled 1.5 miles and went to an altitude of between 3,000 and 5,000 feet. And this really cemented the Montgolfier brothers as being celebrities for having discovered this concept of hot air ballooning. But they were not yet ready to do a manned flight. The knowledge and the reputation of the Montgolfier brothers reached Paris and went to the King and Queen of Paris, King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And the king requested a demonstration. And in 1783, in September, the Montgolfier brothers built an even larger balloon and did a demonstration in front of the king and queen. But at this time, they put a sheep, a duck, and a cockerel as passengers in a basket below the balloon. The balloon went 2 miles and traveled at an altitude of 1,200 feet. The brothers started to get a little bit daring and decided that they were going to do a first manned flight, which is a tethered flight. And in October of 1783, they tethered a 60,000 cubic foot balloon and had it rise 75 feet. So it was still tethered to the ground. And the first pilot was Jacques Etienne. And then, having demonstrated that, they knew that they were ready to do an unmanned test. On November 21st, 1783, they took their balloon and hired 2 pilots, Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier and François Laurent de Lardon. And Jean-François was a teacher of chemistry and physics, and François Laurent was a member of the French military. They were the first 2 people to do an untethered manned flight in a hot air balloon on November 21st, 1783. The balloon traveled 5.5 miles and was estimated to have an altitude of about 3,000 feet. Now, around the same time, in 1783, another person was studying the concept of ballooning, and his name was Jacque Charles. Charles was a mathematician, an inventor, and a scientist, and he was studying the properties of hydrogen. Hydrogen had recently been discovered. In fact, it was only discovered about 17 years earlier by Henry Cavendish in England. And Charles had noticed that hydrogen has the ability to change the weight of a glass ampule. And he thought that maybe he could use hydrogen as a balloon. And he based some of those ideas on the work of another scientist named Tiberius Cavallo, who was working in 1782. Now, Cavallo was born in Naples, Italy, and moved to England in 1779. He became a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1781 and had done a lot of experiments with hydrogen. In some of his initial experiments, he attempted to fill animal bladders with hydrogen to see if he could get them to float. And unfortunately, all of those experiments failed. But he did demonstrate that if he filled a soap bubble with hydrogen, it did float. And that's what spurred Jacque Charles to consider hydrogen as a source of lift for a hydrogen-based balloon. Now, there are some advantages and some challenges for using hydrogen. First of all, hydrogen has about 6 to 10 times the lifting capacity of hot air. What that means is that you can make the balloon smaller and lift the same amount of weight, or for the same size balloon, you can carry much heavier weight. The other advantage of hydrogen is that you don't need to have a heat source to remain airborne. Now, in modern hot air balloons, typically the heat source is a propane cylinder with a flame. But with hydrogen, since it has a natural buoyancy, you don't need to have a heat source. But there are some disadvantages with using hydrogen. The first is that hydrogen is very small. It's the smallest molecule on the periodic table. And therefore, it's very difficult to contain hydrogen gas in an enclosed volume. And the second problem with hydrogen is that it's not readily available. In order to use hydrogen as a source for a hydrogen balloon, you have to make it as you need it. And of course, we all know that hydrogen is a very flammable gas, and they knew it at that time as well. Well, the problem of containment was solved by Jacque Charles and two brothers, Anne-Jean and Nicolas Louis Robert. They were called Les Frères Robert in France. And they developed a method to coat silk with a solution of rubber in dissolved turpentine. The turpentine would evaporate, leaving a very thin film of rubber coating the silk, and that film of rubber was impermeable to hydrogen. To make hydrogen, they needed to produce it by treating iron with a mixture of water and acid at a ratio of 1:4. Now, Tiberius Cavallo wrote a book in 1785 called The History and Practice of Aerostation. And in that book, he described how to fill balloons with either hot air or hydrogen. And this is a diagram from that book. On the left-hand side, you see a drawing where there's for a hot air balloon. And in this case, the balloon has a loop at its top, and a rope is passed through that loop. The balloon sits on a platform, and at the center of the platform is a hole where there's a fire built, and the hot air from the fire is captured in the balloon. Once the balloon is inflated, the rope is released, and the balloon then rises. On the right-hand side is a diagram of how to fill a hydrogen balloon. The balloon has a loop at the top, and it's held in place by a rope. The barrels that you see below are barrels of iron, and workers would fill each barrel with a mixture of acid and water. The hydrogen would be released. The pipes would go to a central tank that contained water, and that water would dissolve any acid vapor that got carried over, and then the hydrogen gas would be directed to the balloon through the leather pipes. Once there was sufficient hydrogen in the balloon, the loop at the top would be released, and the balloon would rise. Jacque Charles and the brothers built a small hydrogen balloon and did an unmanned test in August of 1783. This was 88 days before the Montgolfiers' manned flight. The balloon had a volume of about 1,200 cubic feet. It required 500 pounds of iron and 500 pounds of acid and 2,000 pounds of water to produce enough hydrogen to fill this balloon. And in fact, it took them 3 days to fill this small balloon. The balloon was unmanned. It was released from Paris and traveled 12 miles to the northeast to a town called Genesee. It stayed aloft for 45 minutes, and it was such a surprising thing that farmers that saw the balloon when it landed actually attacked it with a pitchfork upon landing. This was the first demonstration of the use of hydrogen as a medium for ballooning. On December 1st, 1783, 10 days after the Montgolfiers' manned flight, Jacque Charles made the first manned hydrogen flight. It was he and Nicole Louis Robert who flew the balloon, and the balloon was only 13,500 cubic feet in volume. This is about 1/4 the size of the balloon that the Montgolfiers used. It traveled 11 miles, stayed aloft for 2 hours, and reached an altitude of 1,800 feet. And because ballooning had become such an important part of French history, it's noted that about 400,000 people witnessed the launch of Charles' hydrogen balloon, including Benjamin Franklin and Joseph Montgolfier. Several years after ballooning, the ballooning milestone, Joseph Michel continued to invent. He invented a water pipe that was used in his factories for making paper, but he died in 1810. And Jacques Etienne died in 1799. His son-in-law took over the paper-making company, and that company is still in existence in France, although it's under a different name. And the French have honored the Montgolfier brothers by calling the word for hot air balloon as a Montgolfier. Jacque Charles' seminal work on hydrogen led to the development of dirigibles and airships for commercial and military use, and he continued to do science and developed a relationship between the volume of a gas at a given temperature, and the equation is shown there. It later became known as Charles's law in his honor. Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier in 1784 continued his exploits in ballooning. He and Joseph Proust traveled 52 kilometers in 45 minutes on a hot air balloon, setting a speed, altitude, and distance record. And unfortunately, Jean-François died in June of 1785, attempting to cross the English Channel in a hydrogen balloon with Pierre Romain. Francois Laurent proposed a crossing of the English Channel in 1784, but never executed it, and he was dismissed from the French military after the French Revolution on allegations of cowardice. He died in 1809. Moving to the next period in history, the hop across the Atlantic. And I'm going to be talking about the first crossing of the English Channel. The two people involved in this adventure was the person who eventually did it, who's pictured on the left, Louis Blériot, and his challenger, Hubert Latham, on the right. Arthur Charles Hubert Latham was born in 1883 and grew up in Paris, sons of a wealthy family. His mother's family were bankers, and his father was a merchant. As it was for men of rich families during that period, you either chose a vocation that either brought fame or power or adventure. And if you're interested in fame and power, you typically went into the law or to politics. If you were interested in fame and adventure, you went into the military. But Latham chose fame and adventure. He flew across the English Channel with his cousin Jacques Charles in a hydrogen balloon in February 1905. He got interested in boat racing and was the helmsman for a power boat race in Monaco in April 1905. And the boat contained an engine designed by Louis Levasseur, and we'll return to Louis in the next slide. Latham, by the way, did win the race in Monaco. From 1906 to 1908, he led an expedition to Ethiopia to collect specimens for the Natural History Museum of Paris. And in September of 1908, he witnessed Wilbur Wright's flight in Le Mans, France, when Wilbur brought the Wright Flyer to France to demonstrate to the French government. This is what sparked Latham's interest in aviation. I mentioned Louis Levasseur, the French engineer who designed the engine for the racing boat. In 1906, he joined forces with a man named Jules Gaston Bide, and they formed a company called La Societe Antoinette. Gaston Bide turns out to be a distant cousin of Latham, and they decided that they were going to design and build engines for airplanes. Louis Blériot, who was the person who actually did the first channel crossing, was vice president of La Societe Antoinette. On Latham's return from his expeditions in Ethiopia, he joined the company and learned to fly and became its chief pilot and instructor, and was flying the plane that I'm showing on the left called the Antoinette. Now, the interesting story about the company and the plane is that Antoinette is Jules Gaston Bide's daughter's name. And so he named the company and the plane after his daughter. Latham went on to set some European records for flight. In fact, in May 1909, he had the longest flight to that period of 67 minutes in the Antoinette. Around the same time, the other protagonist in the story, Louis Blériot, was living at the end of the 1800s. He attended École Centrale, a famous engineering school in Paris. Was kind of an average student. He graduated in the middle of his class, but he was very mechanically inclined. He got a job as in an electrical engineering firm in Paris, but his inventiveness turned toward the problem of illuminating automobiles. And he developed headlamps for automobiles and formed his own company in 1897. The company supplied headlights to Renault and another automobile company at that time called Panhard. And here on the right-hand side of the slide is a Panhard automobile, 12 horsepower automobile from 1902, and you can see it has the Blériot headlamps on it. Now, the company that Blériot developed for the headlamps made him fairly wealthy. He attended the Exposition of Paris in 1900, where there was an exhibit of a model experimental plane, and this really sparked Blériot's interest in aviation. So in 1906, he formed a business to develop and build airplanes under the name Recherche Aéronautique Louis Blériot. And one of the first planes that they made was in November 1907, the Blériot No. 7, and it was the first successful flight, a monoplane, shortly, only a few years after the Wright brothers had first demonstrated powered flight. And the photo on the left, you see Blériot in the Blériot No. 7. It's a pretty rudimentary plane, fabric covered, mono-winged, had propellers that looked more like oars that you would use in a kayak than a modern propeller of today. But he did succeed in powered flight using this particular configuration. Blériot continued to design planes, and in 1909, he set another record. He was the first to fly two passengers in his Blériot No. 12. The two passengers were Alberto Santo Dumont and André Fournier. They're shown here on the right-hand side, sitting in the Blériot 12. Santo Dumont is to the right, André Fournier is to the left, and to the back, sitting on the little bench seat, is Louis Blériot. The first flight was only a distance of 250 meters, but Blériot was the first to accomplish that metric. In July of that year, Blériot attended one of the many air races that were going on in France at the time, the air race in Douai, and he was able to stay aloft for 47 minutes. During that time, unfortunately, the insulation around the engine fell off, and his foot was badly burned, and that he was for several months walking with a limp and using crutches and a cane. Now, the first attempt to cross the English Channel from France to England was made by Hubert Latham in July 19th, 1909. This was 6 days before Blériot's successful crossing, and he attempted it in an Antoinette 4. Here is a photo from the period, and you can see in the middle of the photo in the upper portion, the Antoinette plane as it leaves Calais on its way to England. Unfortunately for Latham, his engine gave out in the middle of the flight. He had to ditch the plane, so he never made it to England and therefore didn't accomplish the Channel crossing. However, he is credited for making the first sea landing of a plane due to this mishap. A few days later, Latham received a new plane, the Antoinette 7, and here's a picture of Latham sitting in the plane. It's a pretty awkward configuration. You can see how high above the plane the pilot actually sits, but Latham was able to fly this plane pretty skillfully. He did not yet make his another attempt. On July 22nd, Blériot arrived in Calais with his Blériot Model 11. A few days later, the weather cleared, and Blériot decided that he was going to make an attempt before Latham had a second chance at it. And so, despite his badly burned foot, Blériot got into his plane. Here's a picture on the left of Blériot just before he took off. You can see there's a bit of consternation on his face. But the picture on the right is a picture from the period, and you can barely see in the middle of the picture, in the upper part of the frame, Blériot and people watching as he leaves Calais. Blériot was accompanied on part of the flight by a French naval vessel called the L'Escopette. Here are pictures from the vessel itself as Blériot passed overhead on his way to England. Now, there was a French poster that was put together describing his flight, and I had a friend of mine who is very fluent in French translate it. So I will show you the timeline of Blériot's crossing of the Channel. So on Saturday, July 25th at 3 a.m., Blériot arrived by car from his hotel in Calais to the location where his plane was kept, called La Baraque. He decided that he needed to make a practice run, so he did a test flight over the town of Sanguet. And it just so happens that Hubert Latham was in the town, and he was staying at a hotel there, and he was awoken by the sound of the engine and was quite surprised. When he checked what was going on, a newspaperman told him that Blériot was readying for an attempt at the Channel crossing. So Latham made his way to La Baraque just in time to see Blériot take off for England. And this was at 4:35 in the morning. Blériot followed the destroyer Escopette for a period, but because of a tailwind, he was actually traveling faster than the ship could go, and he ended up in a fog bank. And so he spent 10 minutes in the fog bank trying to find his way. Fortunately, he stayed above the water. And when during his time in the fog bank, a wind was pushing him toward Deal, which is northeast of Dover. And you can see in the upper middle section of the poster where Deal is. And so he drifted towards Deal. And now when he arrived at the Dover coast, or the English coast, he didn't recognize it. So what he did is he followed some English boats, thinking that they must be on their way to Dover. And in fact, they led him to Dover, and he found a place called Shakespeare Hill. And it was forced into a very quick landing because of the strong headwinds. And on the ground, there was a journalist, Charles Lafontaine, who was waving a tricolored flag, indicating that this is the location that Blériot should try to land. And in fact, he did make a landing. It was actually a pretty hard landing in Dover, but any landing that you can walk away from is a good one. And Blériot was able to walk away from it. And here's a picture from that period when Blériot had just gotten out of his plane after landing. Now, recall that at this point, the Wright brothers were still the preeminent engineers for aircraft. And so the New York Times had an interview with the Wright brothers. And I have some comments here. Now, Blériot, after completing the crossing, was able to claim a prize from the Daily Mail newspaper of £1,000, which he did. But the Wright brothers commented on July 26th, the day after Blériot's flight. And here are some excerpts from those comments. Blériot's successful flight was splendid, said Wilbur Wright this evening. I know him well, and he's just the kind of man to accomplish such an undertaking. He's apparently without fear, and what he sets out to do, he generally accomplishes. This recklessness makes him anything but a good aviator, however, for he lacks entirely the element of caution. His speed was excellent, and his machine made faster time than I thought it capable of negotiating. So in other words, Wilbur is saying, kudos, Blériot, but you're really not a very good aviator. And Orville was a bit more succinct and to the point. He said, I'm glad Blériot won the prize offered for the first airplanist to cross the Channel, said Orville heartily. But I can't for the life of me understand how he ever managed to do it with the flyer that he has. His motor struck us both as being well nigh impossible, while he seemed to lack control over his machine. The great number of accidents in which he figured with his flyer discloses his lack of control, while his engine never could be depended on. So there was I think, a tinge of professional jealousy by the Wright brothers in commenting on Blériot's accomplishment. Now, Latham was not deterred from trying the trans-channel crossing. In fact, 2 days after Blériot crossed, Latham made a second attempt at the crossing in the Antoinette 7. Unfortunately for him, he also had trouble and had to ditch the plane a second time in the Channel, and so he never actually accomplished his goal. But after the crossing, Latham continued to fly. In 1910, he set a world speed record in the Antoinette 7 of 48.2 miles per hour. He set an altitude record of over 4,500 feet. He made the first flight over an American city. He flew over Baltimore on a flight sponsored by the Baltimore Sun. He also flew over the cities of Los Angeles and San Francisco for the first time later in 1910 and then early in 1911. And his life of fame and adventure, I think, caught up to him in June of 1912. He was mauled to death by a wild buffalo during a hunting trip to the Congo. Unfortunately, he was only 29 years old. After the crossing, Blériot became quite famous. In fact, his company received 900 orders for the Blériot 11 between 1909 and 1904. He became president of the company called Societe pour l'Aviation et ses Dérivés. Another name for it is SPAD. In fact, the company SPAD made World War I fighter planes that the French used against the Germans. Blériot was present at Le Bourget Airport when Charles Lindbergh landed there after his transatlantic solo flight in 1927. And in 1930, Louis Blériot established the Blériot Trophy, which he wanted to be given to the first crew that sustained a speed of 2,000 kilometers an hour for more than 30 minutes. Now, to put this in perspective, in 1930, the average speed of a plane was only about 200 to 250 kilometers per hour. So Blériot envisioned a time when planes could travel 10 times their speed in 1930. The Blériot Trophy was not awarded, though, until 1961 to the crew of a Convair B-58 and that was flying out of Edwards Air Force Base. And Blériot had died by then. He had died of a heart attack in 1964. So the Blériot Trophy was awarded to the crew by Blériot's wife, Alice, who died 1 year later. Now let's move on to the Orteig Prize and the mad dash for the Atlantic. So this is early in the 1900s when a lot of people were interested in long airplane flights. A very famous hotelier named Raymond Orteig put up a prize of $25,000 for the first person to fly nonstop from New York to Paris or Paris to New York. Orteig was born in France near the Pyrenees Mountains. In 1882, at the age of 12, he traveled alone across the Atlantic to New York City to live with his uncle. And he worked as a busboy, as a waiter, and eventually got to the point of being a maitre d' at a fine restaurant in New York and was able to save enough money to buy a hotel, the Lafayette Hotel in New York. And he later on went to buy a second hotel. And this hotel became a hangout for French expatriates after World War I. And Raymond Orteig became very wealthy. And in 1919, he put up a prize of $25,000 for the first flight nonstop from New York to Paris. Now you have to understand that at this point in time, airplane engines were not very robust. And the flight to Paris from New York was estimated to take about 36 hours. And in 1919, there was not a plane and there was not an engine that could run for that extended period of time. So nobody was able to claim the Orteig Prize for the first 5 or 6 years. In 1925, Orteig renewed the prize. And by that time, the technology had developed that aircraft engines became much more reliable. The first attempt at the Atlantic crossing was by French World War I ace René Fonck. René Fonck had shot down the most number of German fighters during World War I. In fact, he's credited with 75 victories against German fighters in World War I. Funk had worked together with a Russian airplane designer, Igor Sikorsky, and Sikorsky designed a plane specifically to make the attempt of a flight from New York to Paris. And a picture of that plane is shown on the right, the Sikorsky S-35. The plane had 3 engines because it was felt that if you had more than one engine, if one of the engines gave way, you could still continue with the other engines. Now, the plane itself was originally designed to hold passengers, and so it was very well appointed inside. And you can see that the photo on the right shows that the plane had tables and chairs. There was a little kitchen in the back, and really the idea of managing the weight of the plane was not really considered in the S-35 trimotor that Funk was going to be using. Now, Funk was trying this attempt at the transatlantic crossing 130 days before Lindbergh actually made his crossing. The plane required 2,500 gallons of fuel, and that equates to 15,000 pounds of fuel. The day of takeoff, the plane had weighed about 27,000 pounds. And you can see a photo here and give you some perspective of how big the plane actually was. The plane was designed to have 4 crew members. Rene Funk was going to be the pilot. Lawrence Curtin would be the navigator. Jacob Islamov was going to be the engineer on the flight, and Charles Clavier was going to be the radioman. This photo shows a picture of the S-35 on September 21st, 1926. The day that Rene Funk and his crew were going to attempt the transatlantic flight. What you see is the main landing gear here, and behind the main landing gear, these smaller wheels, which are auxiliary wheels that were used to help the plane take off because the plane was so heavy. There's a set of wheels under this engine, there's a set of wheels under this engine, and then there's a set of wheels under the tail. Funk and his crew loaded up the plane, got on the plane, took it out to the end of the field. The runway was a dirt strip. It had been raining. There were ruts in the strip, but they decided that they were going to go for this attempt. And so the plane lumbered down the airstrip. It was overloaded. It was 4,000 pounds overloaded. In fact, that was one of the issues with the difficulty of getting the plane off the ground. As it continued down the runway, however, the left auxiliary wheels fell off. The plane lurched to the left, but Rene Funk was able to maintain control. Shortly thereafter, the right auxiliary wheel fell off, right there. And then further down the runway, the auxiliary wheels on the tail of the aircraft fell off, and in fact bounced up and damaged the rudder. Now, Funk was getting to the end of the runway. There was a 20-foot embankment that he needed to clear, and just as he got to the end of the runway, the plane lifted off and made it over the embankment. Everybody that was watching looked in amazement as the plane disappeared on the other side of the embankment, and then there was a loud explosion. And what the participants saw was the plane on fire. And there's a picture on the left of the plane actually on fire. It crashed on the other side of the embankment. The picture on the right is the wreckage of the plane after the fire was eventually extinguished. Sadly, 2 people perished. Jacob Islamov and radioman Charles Clavier perished in the fire. Rene Funk and Lawrence Curtin were able to escape because they were in the cockpit. They broke the window in the ceiling of the cockpit and were able to escape without injury. So the first attempt in September of 1926 to achieve the Orteig Prize ended in failure. So Rene Funk is now out. The next person to try is Admiral Richard Byrd. Byrd became famous because in 1926, he was the first man to fly to the North Pole and back. And Byrd decided that he was going to try to be the first to do a transatlantic crossing. He worked with airplane designer Anthony Fokker, and Fokker designed a tri-motor plane called the America. It was pretty much based on the plane that Byrd used to fly to the North Pole and back. The plane itself had, as I mentioned, 3 engines. It was going to carry 4 passengers. The plane was tested in a test flight in Teterboro, New Jersey in April of 1927, 34 days before Lindbergh took off on his flight. There were 4 passengers on board. Anthony Fokker was going to be the pilot. Richard Byrd was a passenger. Floyd Bennett would be the pilot for the transatlantic attempt, and George Noville was the engineer. The plane took off on this test flight and flew actually quite well. The test flight was considered pretty much a success while the plane was in the air, but as it tried to land and the engines were set to reduced speed, the tail of the aircraft started to rise, and Fokker knew that there was going to be a problem here. So he gunned the engines, went around for another pass, and realized that the plane was too nose heavy to make a landing at low speed. So he had to try to land the plane at full power. And just before touchdown, he would cut the power to the engines to try to coast the plane to a stop. Unfortunately, during that attempt, after he cut power, the tail again rose and the plane landed upside down across the landing field. Byrd and 2 others were injured during this flight, during this crash. And Anthony Fokker, although walked away unscathed. And here's on the right-hand side, a headline from the New York Times showing that Byrd's plane had crashed and that there were going to be a delay of many weeks before Byrd can make another attempt at the Orteig Prize. So Richard Byrd is out. The next 2 people to try the transatlantic flight were 2 naval aviators, Noel Davis and Stanton Worcester. They had secretly worked with the American Legion to get a plane specially designed for the transatlantic flight. And the plane is pictured on the right. It's called the Keystone Pathfinder. You can see it's got the word American Legion emblazoned on it. It's another tri-motor plane. And Noel Davis and Stanton Worcester were being very systematic on how they tested this plane. They gradually increased the amount of fuel, tested the airworthiness of the plane, and they were doing one last test flight of the plane in Virginia prior to making the transatlantic attempt. The plane was fully loaded with fuel. It got on the runway, went down the runway, but it was still quite heavy and only got off the ground at the last minute at the end of the runway. Unfortunately, there was a stand of trees at the far end of the runway that the plane needed to clear, and it didn't look like it was going to make it. So the pilots made a hard banking turn. The plane went into a stall and then crashed in a marsh just along the side of the airstrip. And unfortunately, Davis and Worcester were trapped in the cockpit and died of suffocation. The picture on the right is the New York Times report on April 27th, the day after their flight, showing the tragic consequences of their air crash. So far, all 3 triplanes, the Rene Funk plane, the Byrd's plane, and the Stanton and Worcester plane have crashed. And sadly, Worcester and Davis were lost. The next attempt was made on May 8, 1927, by Charles Lindbergh and Francois Colli. Lindbergh and Colli were pilots during World War I. In fact, Lindbergh had, I think, 43 victories against German fighters during the war. Francois Colli started as an infantryman during World War I and then became a pilot and joined Lindbergh in this attempt. Now, they were going to try something that others didn't try. Instead of flying from New York to Paris, they were going to fly from Paris to New York in the plane that's shown on the right here, the Louison Blanc, which translates into the White Bird. They left Paris on May 8th, 1927. They were spotted in several locations on the French coast and on the coast of Ireland, but unfortunately, they never made it to the United States. And in fact, here's a New York Times article indicating that the fate of the Atlantic flyers is unknown, and there were absolutely no sign of either of the plane anywhere along the route after their last sighting. And to this day, we don't know where Nungesser and Coley ended up. But there were sightings, as I mentioned, of their flight, mostly in Europe. After they left Paris, they were sighted on the coast of France, on the southern coast of England, and on the coast of Ireland. And these are people that actually saw the white plane fly overhead. There was a fisherman that reported seeing a plane wreckage just off the coast of France, and he reported it to the French Navy. But the French Navy was never able to find any wreckage, so that's probably an erroneous report. The next reports of perhaps a plane were in Newfoundland. In 1927, there was a sighting of the white bird over Harbor Grace, just on the other side of the bay from St. John's, Newfoundland. There were some people in St. Mary's in Newfoundland who claimed to have heard a plane in distress. And then there were some fishermen and trappers who claimed that they had seen wreckage of a plane in Gull Pond. And in fact, there were 4 people who claimed that they had actually pieces of a plane that they had recovered from the pond. Unfortunately, when they were asked to actually show those pieces, one person said that his piece was stolen. The other person said that his piece was lost in a move. And the other 2 people said that they lost their piece in a house fire. So there's actually no evidence of any plane in Gull Pond. No hard evidence of any wreckage was found at the pond itself either. A fisherman in St. Pierre also claims to have heard a crash in the ocean, but there was no wreckage found. And also in the Maine coast, there were sightings of or claims of wreckage, either wreckage or plane being heard in Cooper, Maine. Fishermen claimed to have heard a crash, but there was no wreckage found. And hunters claimed to have found wreckage in a woods outside of Cooper. They never reported it because they had seen some logging activity nearby. They assumed that it had already been reported. When the authorities went back to try to find that wreckage, no wreckage was found. So we have reports and sightings, Nungesser and Coley. We have no hard evidence that there was a wreckage found in any of the locations. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, to this day, we don't know where they went down. So sadly, Nungesser and Coley were lost. The next person to be involved with the Orteig Prize was Charles Levine. Levine was born in Massachusetts, grew up in the New York area. He actually made a whole lot of money after World War I, selling surplus goods that he acquired from the military into the open market. In fact, he made his fortune by that. In 1926, he got associated with Giuseppe Belanca. He and Belanca formed the Columbia Aircraft Company. Belanca was a famous aircraft designer at the time, and he had designed this plane, the WB-2, also called the Columbia, after the Columbia Aircraft Corporation. And at the time, this was the plane that everybody was going to bet their money on that could make the transatlantic flight because of its design. And in fact, Charles Lindbergh tried to buy this plane from Levine, and they had a verbal agreement on the price for the plane. Lindbergh went to his backers in St. Louis, got a check for the price, went to New York to pay for the plane. When Levine showed up, he said, Lindbergh, I will sell you the plane, but I'm going to tell you who can fly it. And of course, Lindbergh was incensed when he heard this because he knew who was going to fly it. Lindbergh was going to fly it. But Levine said, no, I want to retain the right to determine who's going to fly the plane. And Lindbergh left and had to find another company to make a plane for him. He eventually made his way to San Diego to Ryan Aeronautical, and they designed the Spirit of St. Louis for him. Now, Levine decided that since Lindbergh was not going to try for the Orteig Prize on his plane, that he was going to do it himself. He was very much interested in getting the publicity for the transatlantic flight because he was very confident that his plane could do it. And so the reason for getting the publicity is he wanted to be able to sell the rights, the movie rights and the book rights for that trip to the highest bidder and make money off of that. He had several different pilots in mind, but Belanca insisted that he use Clarence Chamberlain because Belanca and Chamberlain had worked together in Belanca's previous company, Wright Aircraft. Levine also included Bert Acosta, who's shown on the left. Acosta was another pilot and actually taught Levine how to fly. And a co-pilot was selected, and his name was Lloyd Berthoud. So Levine had not decided between Chamberlain and Acosta just yet, but he knew that he wanted Berthoud to be the co-pilot. As a demonstration flight, Levine and Chamberlain made an endurance flight in the Columbia and were flying around New York for 51 hours, 11 minutes, and 25 seconds. So they demonstrated that the plane could easily make the long trip from New York to Paris, and that heightened the interest in Levine's team making the cross-Atlantic trip. As I mentioned, Levine was very interested in publicity, so he decided that he was going to choose the pilot by a lottery on the day of the flight. Now, Bert Acosta, who was one of the potential pilots, was pretty frustrated by that, and he resigned, leaving just Chamberlain and Berthoud. And Chamberlain and Berthoud had a verbal agreement with Levine that in the event that something happened to them, that Levine would have taken out a life insurance policy, and the life insurance policy would pay to support their families. So when Levine showed up with the contract, that clause was omitted. And so Berthoud took Levine to court over this disagreement, and the court locked up the plane in a hangar. And Levine tried very hard to get the injunction lifted, and it was finally lifted on May 20th, hours after Charles Lindbergh had already left on his transatlantic flight. So because of a legal agreement, Chamberlain and Berthoud missed out on making the first transatlantic flight. And we all know that Charles Lindbergh left the morning of May 20th, 1927. This is a poster that shows his flight path to the northeast to Newfoundland, across to Ireland, and then south to Paris. The flight took 33.5 hours, and Lindbergh was a world sensation for being first doing it solo, for doing it in 33.5 hours, and doing it in a plane that only had a single engine. Now, Levine was not deterred. He and Chamberlain decided that they were going to try to outdo Lindbergh. And so 16 days after Lindbergh's flight, Levine and Chamberlain flew 3,900 miles, almost from New York to Berlin, on a flight that took 42 hours and 45 minutes. It was the longest nonstop flight up to that point. And based on that flight, Levine was considered the first transatlantic passenger. But of course, nobody really remembers that Levine and Chamberlain made such a long flight. Admiral Byrd also made an attempt about 41 days after Lindbergh's attempt. He did make it to Paris, but never landed because Paris was so socked in with fog, and he spent about 5 or 6 hours around Paris trying to find a place to land his plane. And eventually, he had to head out toward the French coast, and he ditched the plane on the French coast. So he never made the nonstop flight to Paris, but he is credited with a nonstop flight across the Atlantic. After the Orteig Prize, René Fonck became the inspector of the French fighter forces in France. And because of his association with some of the French fighter pilots, the Vichy government in France tried to use him to arrange a meeting between Marshal Pétain and Hermann Goering, which he did, but that landed him in hot water because Fonck was accused of collaborating with the Vichy regime. A later investigation cleared him of any collaboration charges. Admiral Byrd, after trying his transatlantic flights, continued his life of adventure and exploration, by going to the Antarctic and being the first to fly to the South Pole in 1928. In 1929, he was promoted to Rear Admiral at the age of 41, the youngest admiral in aviation history. And in 1934, he spent 5 hours in the Antarctic during the winter, where he nearly died of carbon monoxide poisoning because of the stove that he was using to heat his cabin. The story of his survival during the Atlantic is chronicled in his book called Alone, and it's a really interesting book, and I really recommend it. He continued his Antarctic expeditions through 1947. Charles Levine had a tough time after the transatlantic crossing. The stock market crash of 1929 was really a tragic event for him. He lost all his money in the stock market, and during the Depression, he was taken to court by the U.S. government because he owed $500,000 in back taxes. At the time, he only had $500 to his name, which he gave to the government, and the government had to write off the remainder. He was arrested for trying to buy die stamps to stamp out counterfeit 2 franc coins, French franc coins. In 1935, he divorced his first wife and married again the next day. In 1937, he was charged with smuggling a ton of tungsten powder from Canada and served 2 years in federal prison, during which his second wife divorced him. And in 1942, he was convicted of trying to smuggle a German alien into the United States through the Mexican border. So unfortunately, Charles Levine was kind of checkered during the years of the Depression and early part of World War II, but we don't hear from him again until 1991, when he died in New York City. So all told, the Orteig Prize resulted in the deaths of 6 aviators. 3 aviators were injured, and the loss of 4 planes. And ultimately, Charles Lindbergh is credited with the first transatlantic flight, but he was spurred on clearly by the efforts of the other participants. So you can see that there's a whole number of people that we should keep in mind when we consider the aviation firsts. I mean, these are people who don't just witness history, they make history. And it's through their courage and their insight and their sheer force of will that they worked in the competition to try to meet those aviation firsts. And they really need to be remembered. And so it brings to mind a quotation from Theodore Roosevelt. He says, "It's far better to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to take rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much, because they live in the gray twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat." Teddy Roosevelt, 1889. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.